From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Samantha Selinger-Morris. It's Monday, November 13th. Will there ever be peace in the Middle East? And if so, how can it be accomplished? This is one of the great questions of our time. Multiple deadly wars have been fought to try and achieve lasting harmony between people who have been divided for generations. It's at the heart of the latest atrocities that the people in Gaza and Israel have been suffering through for more than a month. But the problem, says Dr Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories, is that everyone, from politicians to soldiers, have often been fighting for the wrong thing. Today, she joins me to discuss what is needed to stop the seemingly unending suffering in the Palestinian Territories and Israel. Dr. Albanese, to start, can you tell us just briefly a little bit about yourself and what is it that you actually do for the UN?
So, first of all, thanks for having me. As a special rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territory, my main role is to report on the violations of international law that occur in the occupied Palestinian territory, namely the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem, that Israel has occupied since 1967. I report annually to the General Assembly and the Human Rights Council, but I also interact and receive complaints from victims of human rights abuses.
Okay. And you've long advocated for the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination. So when did you first become interested in the plight of the Palestinian people?
Look, I grew up in a country where, and at a time in Italy, 40 years ago, when Palestine was a domestic issue. So in my country, there has always been historically a strong support for Israel, seen as the state of the Jewish people after the Holocaust. So I grew up with this sense, but also there was huge support for Palestinian rights. And so this was somewhat part of my upbringing, which is very different from now because the question has been completely demoted from the public debate. But then I started to engage with the question of Palestine when I was in London and through my studies, because I started dealing with the question of Palestine from a legal point of view. And I realized that so much had not been done and so much had still to be said, because treating the question of Palestine as a humanitarian issue, as an intractable conflict is just wrong. International law is indispensable to get out of the impasse, and still it has been put aside and marginalized. The abuses against Palestinians, detainees and prisoners have been documented for 30 years. So why so? So I looked at the legal grounds that lead to Palestinians being arrested and detained. And Palestinians are arrested and detained because of draconian military orders. There are 2,500 military orders written by soldiers, applied by soldiers, reviewed in military courts by soldiers.
What sort of draconian laws are you talking about, or orders?
So, being part of a gathering of 10 or more people where political issues are discussed, which are not authorized, political gathering that is not authorized by the army, can lead to 10 years in jail. Or possessing materials, flyers or books or items that are banned, that are considered hostile to the occupying power, can lead you to 10 years in jail. Or being in a closed area, in a closed military area, can lead you to 7 years in jail. Now, think that Israel declares closed military areas in the West Bank very often, while 60% of the land is fully controlled by Israel in the West Bank, and 20% is closed military area. And these are places where Palestinians live. So the very fact of being a resident in those areas means that you can be arrested and detained. Children can get arrested in the middle of the night, and there are 13,000 children who have been arrested in the past since 2010. And on top of it, you have hundreds of permits. Palestinians have to apply to take residence, to move abroad, to get married, to open a business. Everything is regulated by the Israelis through the military regime. Really, with the press of a button, all the permits can be denied for security reasons. So this is the draconian system. It's a military dictatorship. There is no other way to describe it.
Can you tell me about the legalities of the current war? Is Israel justified in its response in this large-scale bombing of Gaza, given that the citizens in Israel were, of course, massacred and kidnapped? Or are they committing war crimes?
So on the 7th of October, Hamas and whomever joined Hamas's action committed war crimes. No question about that, because killing civilian and taking civilian hostages is a war crime. And so the attack should have been repelled and justice should have done its course. What Israel has done, which was waging a war against the Gaza Strip under the pretext of Hamas being there, is not in line with international law. Israel has invoked the right of self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter, and I know that this argument resonated a lot in this country, like in the rest of the West, is just wrong from a legal point of view. Let me tell you why. First of all, because states might agree or not, but this is the interpretation of the supreme judicial organ of the UN. There is a right to wage a war, to repel an attack or an imminent threat of attack emanating from a state, not an armed group within a state. This is the American doctrine as of Afghanistan and Iraq, but this is not what the ICJ says. And particularly in the case, there is a second reason. In the case of Israel, the ICJ in 2004 said that while recognizing the threats that Israel faces in the occupied Palestinian territory, it cannot invoke self-defense against the people it occupies. You see, so the response should have been under the IHL framework, so law and order, and so policing, and plus there is a multilateral system, so Hamas could have been demilitarized, as it has happened in other contexts, through the United Nations system.
Sorry, but just to push back on that, how would the UN have the power to demilitarize Hamas?
By ending the occupation and having the United Nations. There are so many forms. There are peacekeeping missions who have been doing that in many contexts. I mean, the multilateral system has been absolutely paralyzed on the question of the occupied Palestinian territory, politically, from a humanitarian point of view, and also legally, because there has been no one other than special rapporteurs and the Commission of Inquiry on Israel-Palestine in the United Nations saying that self-defense does not apply here. Of course, there are scholars, but the United Nations has been silent. And again, for me, it's a huge failure of the UN system.
We'll be right back. So, do you think the Israeli response to October 7 amounts to genocide?
There is a risk of genocide, yes, indeed. Genocide is the intent to destroy in full, in part, a national, religious, ethnic, or racial group. And it can happen through different acts, like the killing of the members of the group, the creating living conditions that make life of this group or part of this group unlivable, and also the infliction of severe physical and bodily harm. All of this is happening in Gaza, but think of starving people to death. There was already a blockade which kept the people barely alive in many areas in Gaza. Israel has shut down electricity, water, entry of food, medical supplies and fuel. There are hospitals, prenatal units who have shut down as we speak. And there are people who are drinking seawater, families of 18 people living on a loaf of bread. And the humanitarian aid which has entered can just provide relief to the 4% of the people while they are being bombed. We have lost our humanity here. Seriously, I've never seen anything like this happening.
Dr. Albanese, just to wrap up, what is the solution here? A ceasefire may save lives, but what happens to Palestinian statehood?
Yeah, no, Samantha, there are two things. So first of all, the current atrocities must stop. Even if Israel had, and it doesn't, but even if Israel had the right of self-defense, which doesn't mean it doesn't have the right to protect itself, of course it does. But even if it had the right of self-defense, what it's doing, it's a clear violation of international humanitarian law because it's disproportionate. It doesn't respect the principle of distinction and proportionality. So, the numbers of those who have been killed and injured and displaced speak for themselves. So what is needed now to stop all this is a ceasefire. a ceasefire with humanitarian corridors, not to Egypt unless the Palestinians want it. There is Israel and there is the occupied Palestinian territory. So the rest of the occupied. And in any case, none of this measure can result into a forcible transfer, which doesn't allow the people to return. If there is one place where 75% of the people of Gaza have to return, this is Israel, modern day Israel. But then after dealing with their emergency, which is to happen under the aegis of the United Nations as a multilateral independent force. And again, the United Nations have full capacity to do that. But countries like Australia should encourage it, should push for it and sustain such an option instead of giving carte blanche to Israel to do what it pleases, because this is clearly outside what is permitted by international law. But after this, the day after, which looks much more far away than it has ever been. Look, people are asking for rights, for equal rights, being that in a form of independent state, a Palestinian state which lives side by side in freedom, equality, and dignity with Israel. Otherwise, in one state where everyone enjoys, again, as I said, equal rights, dignity, and freedom. I know that now everything looks fantasy, but this is what the international community needs to pursue. Otherwise, this cycle of violence will continue and will intensify.
And how do you think Israel should protect itself? Because, of course, Israel argues we have to get rid of Hamas. The Israeli government, as I understand it, says they want to destroy Hamas. They don't want to destroy Gaza. What do you think they should do to protect their own people?
The best way to protect their own people is to let the Palestinians live in peace, freedom, and dignity. They need to stop brutalizing people because they are really creating the fertile ground for radicalization. Look, when I became a special rapporteur, I was struck by one issue. The international community recites as a mantra, 2 states for 2 people, the 2-state solution. I mean, how can we talk about 2-state solution where the territory, which is an integral part for the realization of a state, an independent and sovereign state, is taken away, is chipped away day after day, home after home, inch of land after inch of land. You cannot have a state without the exercise of the right of self-determination, which is the right of a people to live freely as a people, politically, economically, culturally, over a given territory. So the best way to ensure the security of the Israelis is to ensure the security of the Palestinians and the occupation and the colonization and the apartheid.
Dr. Albanese, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carr-Katzel, with technical assistance by Chi Wong. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want more of our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Samantha Selinger Morris. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.